Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two promises. My name's David Woodall with the United Church of Canada and the Emsdale Pastoral Charge. These are the words of Elaine St. James. When loneliness came my way, it came quietly like the fog creeping off the ocean, and like fog it blanketed my life in shades of gray. I'd moved to a coastal town where my married daughter lived because I had 2 challenging books to write. I needed privacy. I needed to be alone. But I soon found myself without zest, mildly depressed, living daily with a vague ache in my emotions. Since the feeling had no dramatic cause or content, I didn't recognize it for what it was. Instead, I blamed the unaccustomed heaviness of spirit on the fact that I'd moved from the stimulating city, leaving most of my family and all my friends behind. Had it been dramatic loneliness, I could have diagnosed it at once, for I was something of an expert on dramatic loneliness. In the big city, while working on a metropolitan newspaper, I had written an in-depth series called The Lonely Legion. This came about when my editor saw a national poll that concluded that loneliness is often a major factor in mental, emotional, and physical illness, and that the loneliest spots are the big cities. At the end of this unhappy assignment, I felt myself wise in the ways of loneliness, but now, in my new surroundings, nothing I had learned applied to me. I was in good health. Love was instantly available, only a phone call away. The neighbors were friendly. On my solitary walks, I nodded and passed the time of day. At church, I was cordially smiled upon, and I smiled cordially in return, and I made no connection between loneliness and the mild depression that continued to plague me. Prayerfully, with God's help, the depression would either lift, or I would learn to live with it. Instead, with God's help, my mother came to live with me. 20 years earlier, this prospect would have filled me with dread. For while I dearly loved and admired my mom, living with her was like living with a compact tornado. Her style was energetic, gregarious. She never saw a stranger. And wherever Mom was, you could count on whirlwind activity. But I felt sure that Mom, at age 90, would be content to sit in her chair, remembering. I was wrong. On our first Sunday at church, she managed to invite seemingly all the ladies of the congregation, individually and collectively, to call. On our walks, she sought to engage everyone we met in conversation, and to my acute discomfort was as uninhibited as ever. She instructed the lady next door, a dedicated gardener, on the correct use of rose spray. She interrupted the postman on his appointed rounds to inquire whether he had been in the army and if he had any children. She poked little boys playfully with her stick and even queried a gruff gentleman down the way as to why his skinny old cat, obviously a nursing mother, had not been spayed. She asked him, "Did you drown the kittens yourself, or let the pound do it for you?" With a shudder, I could see my neighbors turning hostile. But that's not what happened. To my puzzlement and dismay, the kids on the block began, at her invitation, to call her granny and to bring lizards and bugs for inspection. The church ladies duly called with cakes and cookies and occasionally accompanied her on her walks. The gardener next door brought her well-sprayed rosebuds. And as if by magic, the gruff gentleman appeared and presented her with a very much alive ball of fluff, whose life was to be saved by adoption. But others who came bearing small gifts were complete strangers to me. "They're not strangers," my mother said firmly. "Well, they're not friends. No, they're our neighbors." She continued to give them strong coffee, tell them tales, listen with sympathy and understanding to their personal problems, until she knew more about our neighbors in 4 weeks than I had in the time since I lived there. She enjoyed it, and so did they. I didn't. Gone were the quiet afternoons. Gone my cherished privacy. True, I didn't have time for foggy depression, but my disposition suffered as I dutifully passed coffee cups, washed up, swept away crumbs, changed the kitty box, and found places for gifts. However, I scolded myself, it's bringing real joy to a very old lady whom you love. So I plastered on a smile and endured. Of course, Mum saw through the smile, but she held her peace until a moment when I'd hung up the phone after talking to a dear friend in the city and was bemoaning the distance between us. Then she said, "You know, you've always been a good friend and a lousy neighbor." On the day that Mum broke her hip, life changed for both of us. After the hospital, it was necessary for her to go and live in a nearby convalescent home. As for me, I was left to my splendid solitude. For a time, I reveled in it. Then I began to miss the upbeat of Mum's drums summoning me to her small celebrations. I actually missed her gaggle of visitors, the ringing doorbell, the voices and laughter. The house seemed too empty, too quiet. The dull grayness settled in again with a vengeance, forcing me to ask questions. Was my chosen aloneness, which I so valued, infected with loneliness, the root of so many evils? Was it self-centered isolation, rather than work-centered concentration as I'd imagined? If so, did the key to the situation lie in Mother's charge that I was a lousy neighbor? Was I a lousy neighbor? My yard was manicured, my manners pleasant. I let boys and girls tramp through my hedges to retrieve lost balls. I supported Boy Scouts, Bluebirds, and the high school band when it wanted to play in Denmark. I was good for an egg or two on demand. What was a good neighbor anyway? When I asked my mother, she said, "Well, try Luke 10. So I did. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him and beat him and went away and left him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, pass by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling near, came near him, and when he saw him he was moved with pity. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave it to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you, whatever more you spend.' Here were 4 men on a lonely, wild road. One left half dead by robbers, 2 fellow countrymen who passed by on the other side, and a stranger who stopped and assisted him. Christ called the man from Samaria a good neighbor, and told his followers to go and do likewise. I realized with a shock that I was a passerby. Oh, surely I would have felt compassion and prayed for the injured man, but the Samaritan got involved. He gave him first aid, a ride on his horse, the assurance of care, person to person. This too was my mother's magic. She gave her warmth with wisdom in a most personal way. What if I wanted to get involved? What did I have to give? To my astonishment, the answer was nothing. I couldn't bind up wounds or turn myself into a magnificent extrovert. I didn't bake, do ceramics, grow roses. I couldn't even make a decent cup of coffee. I never felt so deflated, so humble, as I did when I poured out this bankruptcy before the Lord. And then one afternoon as I sat reading, it occurred to me that the one thing I did have was books. Hundreds of books. My most treasured possessions. What if I were to make use of them in some way? Make them available to my neighbors? But I didn't lend my books, even to friends, because sometimes they weren't returned. Libraries were for lending. I couldn't take the risk. Still, the idea wouldn't go away, that books were the key to my being a good neighbor. But even if I tried lending a book to a neighbor, I might run the risk of rejection. Oh, I watch TV, thanks. Or having my goodwill ridiculed. It's that odd book lady. One day I took a cherished edition of T.S. Eliot's Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats off the shelf. I went down the way to the gruff man who had the mother cat that Mum had been so steamed up about. He was surprised, but he took the book. With this experiment a success, I began gingerly to lend more books. What an awakening! As I started talking to people, matching them with the books I thought might appeal to them, I found that Yvonia, the young mother who did my house cleaning, also taught Sunday school. Frances, one of the church ladies, had done her master's thesis on the Hound of Heaven. And Lorraine, my rose-growing neighbor, was a mystery buff. As the books flowed out, I discovered how much I had in common with people I'd been living among. Relationships developed in line with what I had to give. When my books disappeared occasionally, I let them go and thank God for the fresh brown eggs that Frances brought, Yvonne's enchiladas, and the blocks of frozen Scotch broth Rosemary hung in a bag on my doornail. I was grateful, too, for the loving concern of my block neighbors. In a blackout, my bell rang. Do you need these candles? If I failed to appear on my solitary walks, just calling to see if you're all right. I myself served as an emergency babysitter. These were very special relationships, for I had really learned to love them, and this alive, participating love of neighbor was a new kind of love to me. I saw it could help others dramatically. It had saved the life of a man on the Jericho Road. It could have saved many lives in the Lonely Legion. And as Christ promised, it could also help me. We have no idea how long any of us are going to live. Apart from some healthy habits and approaches to life, the length of days is not in our hands. Some years will be wonderful and some will be very trying. Some days will be wonderful and some days will be very trying. The very best wisdom from Jesus about how to live our lives is the whole message behind today. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the law and the prophets, and I might add all the self-help books, all the psychological theories, and all the personal betterment videos hang on these two commandments. Loneliness is one of the major social laments of our time. There are a lot of lonely people in this world. There are a lot of lonely people everywhere. Oh, maybe not lonely all the time, but there are those moments when the gray dullness settles in with a vengeance, when that vague ache gnaws away at us. When it seems that there is this awful superficiality in life, in love and relationships, when there seems to be only the unending days lying ahead. As always happened, we are well taught by Jesus how to live. Reach out to each other. Let others reach out to you. Give some comfort to someone in need. Do what you can to ease another's burdens. Let others help you with your troubles and burdens. We're not islands. We are family. We're community. And we will do what we can to help.